5 months after the divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir? She named you as the dad." The Caruso mansion, once the beating heart of New York's underworld, now stood like a mausoleum of memories, drowning in silence and shadows. 5 months had passed since Dominic Caruso had signed the divorce papers, and yet, it felt as though the ink had never dried on his soul. The man once feared by every rival family, the name whispered in alleyways. The ghost who decided life and death with a single nod, now sat alone in the vast emptiness of his empire. Haunted not by enemies but by echoes of a love he destroyed with his own hands. The marble floors still reflected her footsteps. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the hallways like a ghost that refused to leave. And every glass of whiskey he poured carried her reflection in its amber depths. Nights were the worst. The ticking of the old grandfather clock grew louder with every hour, counting down the seconds until he would see her again, not in reality, but in his dreams. He would wake up drenched in sweat, her name breaking out of his throat, only to remember she was gone, really gone, and that he had been the one to let her walk away. The divorce wasn't just a legal act, it was an execution of everything human left inside him. Elena had been the only one who could reach through his armor, who could calm the storm in him with nothing but her voice. She was the one who taught him how to laugh, how to breathe, how to live without fear. And when she left, she took all of that with her. Dominic tried to pretend it didn't matter. He tried to bury himself in his empire again, to fill the void with business meetings, silent dinners, and meaningless power. But every corner of the house betrayed him. The grand piano she used to play sat untouched, its keys gathering dust like forgotten promises. The dining table that once held candlelit dinners now bore nothing but bottles and ashtrays. Even his men walked softer around him, afraid that one wrong word might awaken the devil that grief had turned into a ghost. He became a stranger to himself, staring at the mirror and seeing not a boss or a king, but a hollow man wearing power as a disguise. Sometimes he would pour 2 glasses of whiskey and leave one across from him, as if expecting her to appear and take it, smile at him, forgive him for everything he couldn't say when she was still his. But silence always answered. Outside, rain fell relentlessly, washing over the city like a confession. The world kept moving, but Dominic stayed still, trapped in his mansion, his throne empty not because he lacked power, but because he lacked her. His phone would ring sometimes, deals to sign, people to threaten, but he would ignore them all. The empire could run itself. His heart could not. He often walked to the garden where Elena once grew white roses. They were her favorite, she said they reminded her of purity, of peace, 2 things that had no place in his world. Now the roses had withered, their petals brown and lifeless, just like everything she'd left behind. He stood there for hours some nights, cigarette burning between his fingers, whispering apologies to the ghosts of petals that never answered. He remembered their last night together, the storm outside, her trembling hands as she packed her suitcase, the tears that fell silently as he watched from the doorway. She didn't scream, didn't curse. She just said, "You don't know how to love without control." That line cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He wanted to stop her, to beg, to say she was wrong, but pride is the most loyal servant of pain, and Dominic's pride was stronger than his heart. Now, it was all he had left, and even that was crumbling. His empire bowed to him, but the walls no longer did. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to mock him with their frozen stares. As if to say, a king who cannot protect his queen is no king at all. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the moon through the glass wall of his room. The city glowed beneath him, his city, his kingdom, but it looked small, meaningless. He lifted a glass of whiskey, his voice rough from silence. "To you, Elena," he murmured. "To the only war I ever lost." He drank it all, but it didn't burn like it used to. Nothing did anymore. He thought of her laughter, the way it filled this same room once, and wondered if she ever thought of him at all, if somewhere, in some quiet corner of the world, she missed him too. The thought hurt, but it also kept him alive. Because love, even when gone, still demands to be felt. And Dominic Caruso was a man cursed to feel at every waking moment of his existence. The night had fallen heavier than usual. The kind of night that presses against the glass and whispers memories through the cracks. And Dominic Caruso sat in his study surrounded by the ghosts of everything he'd built and everything he'd lost. The chandelier above him burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls lined with portraits of dead men who'd worn the same expression he now wore, power wrapped around loneliness. He had been drinking since sunset, each glass another attempt to drown the ache that refused to die, yet the more he drank, the clearer her voice became in his head. "Dominic, promise me you'll stop when power starts owning you." She had said it with trembling lips, her eyes wet but defiant, and he had laughed it off back then, too proud to admit that she had already seen through the empire of gold and lies he lived in. Now, her absence had become the air he breathed. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards reminded him of footsteps that would never return. He wandered through the corridors like a ghost haunting his own home. His hand brushing against the velvet wallpaper. His eyes lingering on the faint outline of where her family photo once hung before he smashed it the night she left. The silence was suffocating. Even his guards outside whispered when they spoke his name, afraid that he might hear, afraid of the man grief had turned him into. He had everything, cars, money, power, but none of it filled the emptiness echoing through his chest. He sat behind his oak desk, lit a cigarette, and stared out at the city that owed him its fear. The skyline glowed in the distance, full of life, but his reflection in the window stared back at him like a stranger. "You built all this," he muttered under his breath, "and you couldn't keep one woman." He let out a bitter laugh, the kind that sounds like breaking glass. The phone on his desk lay silent, mocking him. There was a time it never stopped ringing, deals, threats, orders, but now the empire ran on autopilot, sustained by men who feared his name more than they respected it. He reached for the photograph tucked in his drawer, the only one he hadn't destroyed, the one from their wedding. Elena in her white dress, eyes sparkling like she believed in forever, and him standing beside her, proud, dangerous, untouchable. He traced her smile with his thumb, whispering, "What did I do to you, Elena?" The memory replayed in his mind, the last conversation they had before the divorce. She stood at the door, suitcase in hand, her voice shaking but calm. "I'm not afraid of your enemies, Dominic. I'm afraid of what you're becoming." He remembered reaching for her hand, but she had stepped back. That single movement, that quiet refusal, haunted him more than all his sins combined. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, smoke curling above him like a prayer that would never reach heaven. Then, somewhere deep in the quiet, his phone began to ring. The sudden sound cut through the stillness like a gunshot. Dominic froze, eyes narrowing. No one called this line. No one dared to. He stared at the screen, his pulse thudding in his throat. The number was unknown. For a second, he thought about ignoring it, but something, a whisper of instinct or maybe fate, made him pick up. His voice came out low and cold, the voice that once made men beg for mercy. "Who's this?" For a moment, there was nothing. Just breathing. Soft, nervous breathing. Then a woman's voice, trembling, spoke. "Mr. Caruso?" He straightened in his chair, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Who is this?" The woman hesitated, then said words that made the room tilt, the air leave his lungs. "She named you as the father." The sentence fell heavy and slow, like the final drop of blood in a glass of water. Dominic blinked, his mind refusing to process. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone sharp now, almost dangerous. The woman repeated, softer, "She named you as the father, sir." Dominic stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. Whiskey spilled across papers, soaking into reports that suddenly meant nothing. "Father? Of what?" he demanded, but the line went quiet except for the hum of static, and then the call disconnected. He stared at the phone, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like a man pulled from deep water. For a long time, he didn't move. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock, each second heavier than the last. "Father." The word echoed in his head, foreign, impossible. Elena was gone, he knew that, he had seen the pain in her eyes when she walked away, but what did that voice mean? What had she kept from him? His mind raced through memories, through the nights she had disappeared for hours, through the moments she had looked at him as if holding a secret she couldn't share. He clenched his fists, the anger and confusion colliding until they became fear, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark city below. And for the first time in a long while, the great Dominic Caruso felt small. Powerless, human, somewhere out there. Someone had spoken his name in connection with something pure, something fragile. She named you as the father. The words wouldn't stop echoing. He poured himself another drink, but his hands trembled so much the liquid spilled over. He didn't drink it. He just stood there, listening to the silence that followed the call, realizing that his world, already fractured, had just cracked open a little wider. The mansion, his throne, his empire, all of it suddenly felt hollow, meaningless, because for the first time in his life, Dominic wasn't haunted by the past or the dead. He was haunted by the living, by the echo of a woman's voice and the mystery of what she'd left behind. The storm rolled in without warning. A wall of rain hammering against the city as if the heavens themselves were warning him not to go, but Dominic Caruso didn't hesitate. The moment he traced the call to St. Helena's Hospital, he was already in his car, tires screeching against wet asphalt, headlights slicing through the darkness. His chest burned with questions that refused to silence, her name, the word father, and the chilling final tone of that disconnected call. The city blurred around him as he drove faster than thought, the rhythmic beat of the wipers matching the racing pulse in his throat. Every red light became an insult, every second wasted felt like theft. For years, Dominic had built an empire on control, on knowing every move before his enemies made it, but tonight, he had no plan, only panic. He didn't care who saw him, didn't care that his men would report his disappearance. This wasn't business, this was something raw, personal, human. By the time he reached the hospital, rain soaked his suit, his hair plastered to his forehead. He pushed through the glass doors, ignoring the startled looks of nurses and patients who recognized the infamous face that once filled headlines with violence. Elena Romano, he barked, his voice slicing through the air. Where is she? The receptionist froze, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. Sir? She's in critical condition. The words hit him like a bullet. Without waiting for directions, he stormed down the hallway, his shoes leaving muddy streaks across the sterile white tiles. The scent of antiseptic filled his lungs, but it couldn't mask the metallic taste of fear rising in his throat. He turned the corner, pushed open the door at the end of the corridor, and stopped. The world fell silent except for the soft beeping of machines and the whisper of the rain against the window. Elena lay there, pale and motionless, her skin almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent light. Tubes and wires surrounded her like chains, trapping the life that was slipping away from her inch by inch. Dominic's throat tightened as he stepped closer. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way he had never seen her before. The woman who once stood unflinching in front of his rage, who could silence his storms with a single look, now looked like a ghost caught between worlds. Elena, he whispered, his voice breaking, and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, but then recognition sparked, a flicker of warmth through the pain. Dominic. She breathed, the sound so faint he had to lean closer to hear. Her lips trembled as she forced the words out. He's yours. Dominic froze. His eyes followed hers to the small crib beside her bed. Inside lay a baby, a boy, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, silent, still, impossibly small. His dark lashes brushed against his cheeks, his tiny hand resting near his face. Dominic felt his chest collapse inward. The air left his body, replaced by something heavy and uncontrollable. He took a slow step forward, his heart pounding louder than the machines. He had faced death, betrayal, and war without blinking, but this tiny, fragile thing that looked like it could disappear if he breathed too hard, terrified him. His fingers trembled as he reached for the crib's edge, not touching, just staring. The child's skin was pale like Elena's, his hair dark like his own. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. Elena's eyes filled with tears that slid slowly down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but the effort seemed to pull the last of her strength away. Her hand lifted weakly toward him, shaking, and he caught it instantly, pressing it against his lips. "Don't," he pleaded, "don't say goodbye. Not like this." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said she'd already accepted what he couldn't. "Dominic," she whispered again, her voice fading, "protect him." The monitors began to beep faster. Louder, the rhythm of her heart spiraling out of control. "No," Dominic shouted, gripping her hand tighter. "Stay with me, Elena." Doctors and nurses burst through the door, shouting orders, pushing him aside, but he refused to let go. One of them grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Sir, please, she's my wife." He roared, but the words came too late. The sound of the flatline sliced through the chaos like a blade. A single, endless tone filled the room. Dominic's knees buckled. The nurse reached forward to turn off the machine, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Elena's hand slipped from his grasp, falling lifeless onto the bed. He stared at it, disbelief freezing him where he stood. It was impossible. He had survived gunfights, betrayals, car bombs, everything except this. Slowly, the world came back into focus. The smell of antiseptic. The whisper of rain. The soft, rhythmic breathing of the baby beside her. The nurse, still standing near the door, spoke softly, her eyes wide with sympathy. "Mr. Caruso?" She said something before she lost consciousness. Dominic turned toward her, his voice hoarse. "What did she say?" The nurse hesitated, glancing nervously toward the crib. "She said, 'Don't let them take him.'" Dominic's jaw tightened. "Who?" he demanded. The nurse swallowed hard. "The men she was hiding from." Dominic stood frozen, his mind spinning in a cyclone of disbelief, rage, and an unfamiliar, almost paralyzing fear. The words of the nurse echoing in his ears like a hammer against glass, the men she was hiding from. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct he had honed over decades of surviving the brutal underworld screamed at him to fight, to protect, but the helplessness in the hospital room, the sterile smell, and the fragile life of the baby before him made all his power feel meaningless. His hands hovered over the crib as if merely touching the child would anchor him to reality, and yet, he was terrified that a single wrong move might undo everything. He looked down at Matteo, though he did not yet know the name, and saw a life so pure, so defenseless, that it made the blood in Dominic's veins burn hotter than any rage he had ever felt against a rival. His mind raced. How could Elena have kept this from him? How could the woman who knew every corner of his heart, every weakness, have not trusted him with the only thing that truly mattered now, this small, fragile life that carried part of him? He felt the weight of responsibility press down like a stone on his chest. Suffocating and heavy, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Filled only with the sound of rain thrashing against the windows, the steady beep of machines, and the quiet, fragile breathing of the baby whose existence now tied him to Elena forever. Dominic's hands trembled as he reached out again, this time daring to lift Matteo into his arms. Feeling the tiny body shiver slightly in the warmth of his touch. And a wave of something he had long buried surged up, love. Raw and unfiltered, fierce and terrifying all at once. But the nurse's words refused to let him forget. There were threats out there, men he didn't know, men Elena had feared enough to hide from. His mind leapt to possibilities, imagining shadows waiting in corners, enemies who would stop at nothing to hurt him by taking the child he now held like a treasure he'd never known he had lost. Dominic's chest tightened, rage and protectiveness merging until it became something bigger than himself, a singular purpose that eclipsed fear. Anger, even grief. He would protect this boy at all costs. And woe to anyone who dared stand in his way. He moved, carrying Matteo to the edge of the bed where Elena's still form lay. Touching her face lightly, wishing he could bring warmth back to her cheeks. Wishing he could hear her voice one last time. Even if it was just to beg forgiveness for everything left unsaid. The room felt unbearably small, yet impossibly large at the same time. Filled with invisible threats and silent grief. And Dominic knew in that instant that nothing in his life had ever mattered more than this moment. The life of the child in his arms, and the woman who had risked everything to bring him into the world. He glanced toward the nurse again, her expression taut with worry and urgency, and he demanded with a raw, trembling voice, "Tell me everything. Who are these men? What are they capable of? Where are they now?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the monitors and the empty spaces in the hallway, before lowering her voice into a whisper that made Dominic's blood run cold. "They're dangerous, sir. They've been looking for her for months, and now that he's here, they will come for him." Dominic's grip on Matteo tightened, his knuckles white, and his mind ignited into a ferocious storm of thought and instinct. He could imagine the city streets, dark alleys, abandoned warehouses, men lying in wait. And every one of them would regret crossing him. He was Dominic Caruso. The name alone had toppled men, crushed empires, and commanded fear, but now he felt something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. He didn't just have enemies in business anymore. He had enemies in blood, shadowed figures whose eyes would lock on the boy in his arms, and there was no room for error. Every scenario flashed through his mind in rapid succession: kidnappings, ambushes, threats, and the bitter taste of helplessness that had haunted him the night Elena left. He could almost hear her voice again, faint but firm, echoing from somewhere deep in the room: "Protect him. Whatever it takes." He clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding, and whispered, I swear I will never let them touch you." The baby shifted in his arms. A small movement, as if recognizing the protection being offered, and Dominic's chest ached, a mixture of pride, terror, and overwhelming responsibility washing over him like a tidal wave. He scanned the hospital room, noting every exit, every shadow, every potential threat, and in that moment he realized that the quiet, the fear, the stillness, all of it was just a prelude. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, fierce, uncontrolled, and unrelenting. He didn't care that the city might be watching, didn't care that he had enemies who might strike at any moment. He had one purpose now, singular and absolute: this baby, this fragment of Elena, this living proof of their connection, would survive. And if the world wanted a war, Dominic Caruso would make sure it was a war they would never forget. He lowered his gaze back to Matteo, noticing the faint rise and fall of his chest, the soft, irregular movements that signaled life, and in that fragile rhythm, Dominic found a clarity he hadn't known in years. Love, fear, responsibility, vengeance, all coalesced into a single truth: nothing else mattered. Not the empire, not the power, not the fear he inspired. Only this life. Only this child. Only the promise that Elena had left with him, that final, desperate plea that made his blood run hotter than any battle ever had: don't let them take him. Dominic swallowed hard, every muscle in his body tensing with the knowledge that this was no longer a game of dominance or survival. This was a war for family, a war he had been summoned into unwillingly, a war that would demand every ounce of him. He glanced toward the door again, imagining shadowed figures creeping closer, and a primal part of him roared, let them come. Let them see what it means to cross a Caruso. And as the rain pounded against the hospital windows, as the baby slept quietly, and as the nurse looked on with silent terror and awe, Dominic realized something he had not felt in a long, long time: hope. A fragile, dangerous, unrelenting hope that somehow, against all odds, he would keep his son alive. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, save himself from the emptiness that had consumed him for 5 long, torturous months. 2 nights after the harrowing events at St. Helena's Hospital, Dominic Caruso could no longer sit idle. His mind a restless storm of fear, fury, and unanswered questions. He had carried Matteo from the hospital to a temporary safehouse, hiding in shadows. But even there the weight of Elena's final words gnawed at him relentlessly, whispering through his every thought like a persistent phantom, don't let them take him. The city outside was alive with its usual chaos. But Dominic's world had narrowed to the apartment that once belonged to Elena. A place he had avoided for months, filled with memories and the ghosts of the life he had let slip away. Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon lights as he drove, tires splashing through puddles, every second stretching as adrenaline coursed through his veins. And when he arrived, He slipped into the building with the quiet grace of a predator. The baby cradled carefully in his arms, Matteo's tiny form fitting against him like a fragile treasure he could never afford to lose. The hallway outside Elena's apartment was dim, the paint peeling. The faint hum of a broken fluorescent light casting long, wavering shadows, but Dominic's eyes were sharp, trained to see danger before it could move, and yet tonight, every corner seemed to hide secrets even he could not predict. He fumbled with the keys, finally sliding the lock open, and stepped into the apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and dust, memories clinging to every surface. The room had been quiet for months, untouched, frozen in a time before the divorce, before betrayal, before the revelation that had turned his life upside down. Dominic's gaze scanned the apartment, the remnants of Elena's presence everywhere, the half-empty coffee cups, the delicate silk scarf draped over a chair, photographs he had avoided looking at for months, each item a reminder of the woman he loved, lost, and had failed to protect. But something tugged at the edge of his consciousness, a subtle disturbance. A shadow behind the broken mirror in the corner of the bedroom that didn't quite belong, and instinctively, he moved closer. Matteo secure in his arms, his senses stretched taut, every nerve screaming that danger or revelation awaited. Behind the shattered glass, a small envelope peeked out. Edges frayed, and with a slow, deliberate motion, Dominic pulled it free, feeling the paper's weight and the familiar handwriting he had loved and feared in equal measure. The envelope bore a single, simple inscription, "My love." His heart thudded painfully. A mix of longing and dread as he carefully opened it, unfolding the delicate letter. Its words written with Elena's unmistakable script. The same hand that had once penned love notes in hidden corners of his mansion, now carrying a message that shook the very foundation of everything he believed about his world. Elena's words began gently, almost tender, recounting the fear that had driven her away, the quiet terror that had gnawed at her while she hid their child from enemies that Dominic could scarcely imagine. Enemies who coveted not just power, but his bloodline itself, seeking to destroy the Caruso legacy through the most vulnerable link imaginable. And then the confession hit him like a physical blow, twisting his gut and freezing his lungs. The child is not just yours. He carries something they want. Dominic read the line over and over, each repetition sending chills down his spine, the weight of its implications settling over him like a storm cloud. He had faced death countless times, survived assassins and betrayals, watched blood spill across streets and boardrooms alike. But the idea that his son was a target for reasons beyond his comprehension, something so dangerous that it had driven Elena into hiding, made him realize the magnitude of the war he had unwittingly been thrust into. He pressed his forehead to the paper, trying to absorb her fear, her foresight, her love, and the singular truth that he had been left with: Matteo was no ordinary child. His existence alone had become a threat to unknown enemies, shadowed figures whose intentions were as deadly as they were mysterious. Before he could process the implications, before he could even lift his eyes from the letter to take a breath, a deafening gunshot shattered the silence of the apartment, ricocheting against walls and furniture, sending shards of glass from the broken mirror scattering across the floor. Instinct took over. Dominic dropped the letter, cradling Matteo close to his chest, and dove toward cover, his heart hammering like a drum in his ears. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and gunpowder, and for a heartbeat, time slowed. He could hear the baby's soft whimpers, feel the tremor in his tiny body, and knew that any misstep could cost them both everything. From the shadows, a figure emerged, clad in black, a comm device clipped to their ear, whispering a message that reached Dominic's ears with terrifying clarity: "Target secured. The boss's heir is alive." Fury ignited in Dominic like a wildfire. Every muscle in his body coiled with controlled violence, his mind shifting instantly from panic to the cold, lethal precision that had earned him the fear of entire families. No one would touch his family again, not under his roof, not anywhere in the world. He adjusted his hold on Matteo, feeling the delicate heartbeat beneath his hand, and a primal roar of protection surged through him, drowning out the sounds of the rain, the storm, and even the gunshots. He could hear the assassin moving, calculated and silent, but Dominic was faster, stronger, sharper. The rage of betrayal mixed with paternal instinct had honed him into something unstoppable. For a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only Dominic, the child, and the intruder who had dared to step into his domain. And as the rain pounded against the apartment windows, the flickering light illuminating the broken glass, the letter still lying on the floor as an unspoken testament to Elena's love and fear, Dominic realized the battle lines had been drawn. Invisible yet absolute, this was no longer just survival. This was war, a war fueled by vengeance, protection, and a promise that his enemies would pay dearly for the audacity of threatening the bloodline of Dominic Caruso. Dominic pressed himself low behind the overturned sofa. Matteo clutched tightly against his chest, his senses firing on every level as the figure in black moved with silent precision across the apartment floor. Shadows bending to their will, and he felt a cold, sharp edge of fear for the first time in years. Not for himself, but for the fragile life in his arms. A life that carried not only his blood but the weight of Elena's sacrifice, the legacy of everything he had loved and lost, and the promise of vengeance that now surged through his veins like molten steel. The sound of the gunshots still echoed in his ears, ricocheting off the walls, mingling with the storm outside. Each clap of thunder a cruel mirror to the storm raging inside him. And he realized that the calm, calculated Dominic Caruso, the man who had orchestrated wars and crushed rivals without hesitation, had been replaced in that instant by a father whose instincts demanded survival above all else. The assassin had paused, sensing that Dominic was alive and aware, and the faint click of the comm device buzzed in the corner of his consciousness, sending a chill down his spine as the whispered message echoed again, "Target secured. The boss's heir is alive." Dominic's eyes narrowed to slits, his jaw set in a rigid line as a mix of fury and determination ignited a fire he hadn't felt in years. The apartment no longer felt like a home but a battlefield. And every shadow could hide a bullet, every corner a threat. Yet he could not allow Matteo to see fear, could not allow him to feel the tremor of panic that surged like lightning through his body. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his weight, pressing the baby closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his chest, and began to plan, not for escape, not for surrender, but for domination. For the elimination of anyone who dared threaten the bloodline of Dominic Caruso. He moved like a shadow himself, silent and lethal, keeping the baby shielded. And for a fleeting second, he could hear his own heartbeat, steadying, mixing with Matteo's fragile rhythm, and he knew that every ounce of his skill, every lesson in combat, every memory of betrayal would be directed toward protecting this child at all costs. The letter still lay on the floor, Elena's words burned into his mind, "The child is not just yours. He carries something they want." What could be so valuable, so dangerous, that even now they risked death to claim it? His mind raced, calculating possibilities, mapping every potential threat and escape. Even as the storm outside pounded the city into a frenzy, but the assassin made no move to strike yet. Confident perhaps in the advantage, and Dominic knew that patience, timing, and precision would be his weapons as much as his fists and firepower. With a sudden, swift motion, he pivoted, using the sofa as cover, dragging himself closer to the shadowed figure. Every muscle coiled like a spring, eyes fixed, analyzing the smallest movement, the faintest shift in balance that could betray the intruder's intentions. And then, with a roar that had once silenced entire rooms and toppled empires, he lunged, the fury of a man who had loved, lost, and been betrayed giving him strength beyond calculation. The assassin reacted, but Dominic was faster, striking with a ferocity born not of anger alone but of paternal instinct. Each movement precise, deliberate, aimed to neutralize without harming the child. Every blow and block a testament to the ruthless control he had perfected over decades. Now infused with a singular, unshakable purpose, "No one touches my family." Matteo whimpered softly in his arms, and Dominic adjusted his hold, whispering fiercely, "It's okay. Daddy's here. No one will hurt you." The intruder recoiled, momentarily stunned by Dominic's combination of skill and raw, unbridled fury, and in that instant, Dominic realized the truth that had been hidden in Elena's letter. This was not merely about vengeance or power, it was about survival. About lineage, about a child who carried the weight of something far greater than himself. Every corner of the apartment became a calculated battlefield. Every sound a clue, every shadow a potential threat. And yet Dominic felt clarity amid chaos, a rare, sharp focus that came only when stakes were absolute. He could see the outline of the intruder's comm device, the faint glint of a weapon. And he understood without words that whoever had sent this person had knowledge, preparation, and intent, and that knowledge infuriated him beyond reason. Because his family had been threatened, his bloodline endangered, and no one, not a single soul, would leave this apartment alive without answering for their audacity. He pressed himself closer, the baby's soft whimpers fading under his calm yet commanding presence. And he realized that every instinct, every ounce of skill, every ruthless decision he had ever made in the underworld had led him to this moment, where love, protection, vengeance, and survival merged into one unbreakable resolve. And the assassin, for the first time, recognized that Dominic Caruso was no longer just a name feared in whispers across New York. He was a father who would stop at nothing, a predator whose territory was now the life of the child he held. And in that instant, the rain outside seemed to pause, the storm itself holding its breath, as Dominic's fury, calculated and primal, radiated across the room, promising one thing with every heartbeat, every controlled movement, every furious glance toward the shadowed figure. No one will ever touch my family again. The city had never looked more alive, more dangerous, yet Dominic Caruso moved through it with a singular purpose, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had carried him through the night. Matteo secure in his arms, eyes sharp and calculating, every instinct honed to a razor's edge as he returned to the underworld he had abandoned months ago. The empire he had once ruled with fear and precision now serving as the backdrop for a war that had turned deeply personal. The neon lights reflecting off rain-slicked streets could not hide the shadows that whispered betrayal and death. And every alleyway, every corner, seemed to pulse with the promise of violence. Yet Dominic did not flinch, for he was Dominic Caruso. And this was no longer about power alone, it was about blood, lineage, and a promise he would never break. He navigated the twisting streets to Luca Versetti's headquarters. The man who had once been his closest ally, a man who knew his secrets, his strategies, and the depths of his fury. And as Dominic stepped into the dimly lit office, the faint smell of cigar smoke and aged whiskey greeted him, familiar and somehow comforting. Though the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Luca rose from his chair slowly, eyes widening as he saw Dominic. The baby swaddled in his arms, and Dominic's voice, low, controlled, yet edged with fire, cut through the stale air. I need answers, Luca. Now. Luca hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the mahogany desk, knowing that the man standing before him was not just a boss, not just a king of an empire, but a father whose protective instinct had been unleashed. A force that could flatten the city if provoked. Finally, Luca spoke, his voice tight, each word chosen like a dagger. Dominic. It's not what you think. Or maybe it is, and the truth will burn you. Dominic stepped closer, the baby pressing lightly against his chest, every muscle coiled, every sense alive, and demanded, tell me everything. Who wants him? Why? And don't lie. Luca swallowed hard, the weight of betrayal heavy in his eyes, before confessing, Elena's father. He sold your son's future for money. He thought it was a safe investment. A way to protect the family while securing his own fortune. Dominic's blood ran cold, fury igniting like wildfire in his veins. The betrayal was not only from enemies he had anticipated, but from blood, from family he had once trusted. Luca continued, voice shaking under Dominic's intensity, your son, Matteo, he carries the key to the Caruso fortune. Your enemies know it, and they've been waiting, biding their time. That's why Elena fled, that's why she hid him. She knew they would come. Dominic's jaw clenched, teeth grinding, every nerve screaming with rage. The empire he had once commanded with calculated fear now demanded something different, vengeance with the precision of a predator. "I lost my wife," he growled, fists tightening around Matteo, who stirred but did not cry, instinctively safe in the fortress of his father's arms, "but I will not lose my son. Not to her father, not to anyone. They will regret the day they decided to touch my family." Luca raised his hand slightly, knowing the storm had been unleashed. Knowing the man before him was no longer negotiating, reasoning, or strategizing. He was a father, a monster, and a force of nature combined, and he nodded, stepping back, giving Dominic the space to set his plan into motion. Dominic instructed his most trusted men across the city, sending out squads to secure every safe house, every route, every potential location the boy might be taken to. And for the first time in months, he felt control return, tempered by the knowledge that one wrong move could destroy everything. Hours passed, the city turning into a grid of shadows and lights as Dominic orchestrated the protection of his son with the precision of a master strategist. Yet as night fell, a new terror found him. One that no planning could prevent. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up in the dark apartment he had claimed as a temporary refuge, and when he opened the message, a video began to play. Dominic's eyes widened as the image came into focus, Matteo's crib. Now empty, the blanket that had once cocooned him lying in disarray. And a masked figure standing over the space, voice distorted. Yet chillingly clear, "You have 24 hours to surrender your empire, or the boy dies." Dominic's world narrowed to a single point. His blood boiling hotter than fire as he stared at the screen, heart hammering. Fists clenching around the phone so tightly the device almost bent under his grip. Rage, terror, and love collided into a primal force, a storm more dangerous than any he had ever unleashed in the underworld. The words echoed in his mind, the threat both personal and strategic, daring him to choose between his empire, his legacy, and the life of his son. Dominic Caruso, man who had toppled kings, crushed enemies, and commanded fear across an entire city, felt an unfamiliar but powerful sensation, helplessness, tinged with a burning resolve. He would not cower. He would not negotiate with those who thought to hold his child hostage. Every ounce of skill, every plan, every network he had built over decades would be bent toward one objective. One mission: protect Matteo, reclaim him, and punish anyone who dared challenge the Caruso bloodline. The storm outside mirrored the tempest inside him. Rain lashing against windows like drums of war. Neon lights painting the apartment in harsh reds and blues. And Dominic's mind raced, calculating moves, tracing possible locations, and preparing for the confrontation that he knew would come sooner than later. And yet, beneath the rage and planning, beneath the fury and precision, there was a singular, terrifying awareness. For the first time in years, Dominic Caruso was vulnerable, not because of enemies he could see, not because of gunfire or betrayal, but because of the most precious thing in his life, his son, Matteo, and the masked voice that promised death if Dominic did not obey. As the video ended, the last words lingering like a poison in his mind, Dominic pressed his palm to his forehead, breathed deeply, and whispered with lethal determination, "I will not surrender. No one touches my family. Not now. Not ever." And with that, the gears of war began to turn, the lines of battle drawn. And Dominic Caruso prepared to unleash a fury that would make the underworld itself tremble, knowing that every second counted, every choice mattered, and that Matteo's life depended not on luck, but on the ferocity of a father who had lost everything but would never lose his son. Dominic slammed the phone onto the desk, the masked voice and its ultimatum reverberating in his mind like the toll of a death knell. And in that instant, every ounce of the legendary Caruso fury fused with the raw, unshakable instincts of a father whose child was in peril, turning him into a force that no storm, no enemy, and no betrayal could contain. Matteo's life, fragile and precious, rested entirely in Dominic's hands, and the thought of losing him, of seeing his bloodline threatened, ignited a fire so intense that the shadows in the room seemed to retreat before it. The rain outside hammering against the windows in rhythm with the pounding of his heart. each droplet a mirror of the urgency coursing through his veins. He paced the apartment, cradling Matteo in one arm, his eyes scanning every corner, every piece of furniture, every exit, measuring angles, calculating distances, and imagining the intruder's possible vantage points, knowing that time was now both enemy and motivator. The 24-hour clock ticking down like the fuse to a bomb that could explode at any moment. Dominic's mind raced back to Luca Versetti's confession, the Caruso fortune, the power, the ancient secrets buried within the empire, all now tied to the small life he held against his chest. A life coveted by enemies who would not hesitate to kill to claim it. The betrayal of Elena's father, the labyrinthine schemes that had left the boy vulnerable, and the realization that every decision from this moment forward could be the difference between life and death merged into a clarity so cold, so sharp, that Dominic felt both exhilarated and terrified. He summoned his most trusted lieutenants with a single, precise command, each man understanding without question that Matteo's safety was paramount, that every resource, every street, every ally and informant would be deployed without hesitation. And as his men dispersed into the city like shadows in the night, Dominic leaned against the window, Matteo's soft breathing grounding him even as the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, and began tracing the network of potential threats, imagining who had the reach and cunning to orchestrate such a brazen kidnapping. Every scenario flickered in his mind: rival families, old enemies who had long nursed grudges, those who coveted power within the underworld, and each possibility tightened the coil of rage that surged through him. But one thing was certain: no one would touch his son and live to tell the tale. Dominic moved through the apartment with the precision of a predator, checking locks, securing hidden exits, and planting contingencies, all the while whispering softly to Matteo, a steady, calming presence to counter the chaos that threatened to consume them both. "We're going to find them, and they'll regret it." Hours passed, the storm outside giving way to the flickering light of the city at night, but sleep was impossible, rest inconceivable. Dominic's mind was a chessboard of strategy, every piece placed in anticipation of the next move, every potential outcome calculated and countered. Yet no plan could fully account for the unpredictability of a desperate enemy who had already proven willing to threaten his child. Then, as he reviewed video feeds from hidden cameras and checked on safe houses, his phone buzzed again, this time with a live feed. The grainy footage showing Matteo's crib, empty once more, the camera panning slowly to reveal shadows moving just out of reach. And the masked voice returned, chilling and taunting. "You have 24 hours, Dominic. Surrender, or the boy dies." Rage and terror fused into one undeniable force, and Dominic's vision sharpened, every muscle in his body coiling with intent. This was no longer a threat, no longer a negotiation, it was a declaration of war, and Dominic knew that to hesitate, to falter, even for a second, could cost his son everything. He pressed his palm against Matteo's tiny chest, feeling the fragile heartbeat, and a vow solidified in his mind, more unbreakable than steel: "I will not surrender. I will not negotiate. I will not fail." Every cell in his body vibrated with the certainty that the coming hours would decide everything: his son's life, the empire he had built, and the vengeance that would be unleashed upon those foolish enough to think they could manipulate the Caruso bloodline. The storm of fury and planning escalated as Dominic summoned his most lethal operatives, mapping the city in a web of protection, intelligence, and counterintelligence, each step bringing him closer to the inevitable confrontation, each plan a layer of armor against a faceless, merciless enemy. Yet even as he fortified every corner, checked every route, and deployed every weapon at his disposal, an undeniable tension lingered, the clock ticking inexorably, a reminder that the enemy had chosen the battleground and the terms, daring him to respond, daring him to lose, and Dominic felt that raw, singular focus, the predator's instinct sharpened to its peak. A combination of fear, love, and wrath that left no room for hesitation. As the night deepened, Matteo asleep and safe in Dominic's arms for the moment, the city around them unaware of the war that had begun in shadows and whispers. Dominic stood by the window, staring at the lights below, and whispered into the dark, a promise not just to his son, but to himself, to Elena's memory, and to the legacy of the Caruso name. "You think you can take him from me? You have no idea what you're facing. No one will touch my family." The storm outside echoed his fury. Rain pounding like the drumbeat of a coming war, and Dominic knew, deep in his bones, that the next 24 hours would demand everything, every ounce of cunning, every drop of rage, every fragment of his empire, and that Matteo's life, fragile and precious, was now the most powerful weapon he possessed. One that would ignite a fury the underworld would never forget. The city had descended into chaos. The streets alive with gunfire, explosions, and the deafening roar of engines as Dominic Caruso ignited a war that no one had dared to wage against him before. But this was no longer about power or empire, it was about Matteo. The fragile life that carried his blood, his legacy, and the one piece of Elena he could not afford to lose. With every step he took, the city seemed to shudder under the force of his fury. Streetlights flickering as if afraid to illuminate the path of a man who had turned from feared mob boss to a father unleashed. A predator hunting for the child whose existence now commanded the attention of 5 rival crime families. All converging with lethal intent, unaware that Dominic was not the man they remembered, but something more dangerous, sharper, and deadlier than they could imagine. Gunfire erupted from corners, bullets ricocheting against brick and steel. And Dominic's men, loyal and hardened, fell one by one under the ruthless precision of the attackers. Their cries echoing in his ears as he pressed forward. Every loss feeding the fire that burned hotter than pain, hotter than fear. He had trained for battles like this all his life. But nothing could have prepared him for the rage that surged through his veins as he imagined Matteo's tiny, helpless form in the hands of his enemies, and each explosion, each shout, each clash of metal against metal only made his determination more absolute, more ferocious. Dominic moved like a ghost through the smoke and chaos, his coat torn, his hands bleeding from glass and steel. Yet every step was calculated, each breath measured, every sense honed to a razor's edge, because he knew the child's life was at stake and he could not afford a single mistake. He ducked behind a burned-out car as a grenade exploded nearby, flames licking at the edges of the alley, and felt the tiny weight of Matteo against his chest. A fragile heartbeat guiding him, anchoring him, reminding him that nothing else in the world mattered as much as the boy he had sworn to protect. The streets were littered with bodies, friends and foes alike. The scent of gunpowder and blood heavy in the air, yet Dominic's mind was clear. Every movement deliberate, calculating every angle, every exit, every threat, until at last he reached the warehouse on the edge of the docks. A looming structure of steel and shadow. The place where Matteo had been hidden, where the enemy had made the fatal mistake of thinking they could hide the Caruso heir from his father. Dominic paused at the threshold, listening, feeling, sensing the trap laid out before him, the faintest sounds of movement echoing through the vast, dark interior, and then he moved, silent and precise. Every step a prelude to the storm he was about to unleash. Gunfire erupted as he breached the doors. Bullets cutting through the air, splintering wood and metal. And Dominic responded with lethal efficiency, his fists, guns, and instincts turning the warehouse into a battlefield where death and survival danced on a knife's edge. He cut through enemies one by one, each movement a deadly ballet of rage and protection, until he reached the heart of the warehouse. The sound of his own heartbeat mingling with the cries of his men, the explosions, and the terrified whimpers of his son. There, in a steel cage illuminated by harsh overhead lights, was Matteo, eyes wide with confusion and fear. And the figure holding him, a man Dominic had once called an ally, stood with a cruel smirk. Luca Vercetti, the betrayal cutting deeper than any bullet. "Why?" Dominic roared, fury shaking the walls, shaking his very soul. "Why would you do this?" Luca's grin widened, the arrogance of a man who believed he could challenge Dominic's bloodline evident in every twitch of his face. "You were always the king," Luca said smoothly, voice echoing in the warehouse. "And I wanted the throne." Dominic's gaze hardened, his hand tightening around the gun as he pressed it against Luca's chest, eyes blazing. Then you should have come for me, he growled, voice low and lethal. Not my blood. The tension in the air became almost tangible. A living thing, and with a sudden, brutal movement, they collided in a fight that was raw, primal, and merciless. Fists, knives, and the sound of metal striking metal filled the warehouse as Dominic battled Luca. Each strike fueled by fury, desperation, and a father's unyielding love, while Matteo watched from the cage, whimpering but unharmed, the focus of both their lives. The prize of this bloody duel. Dominic was shot twice, bullets tearing through his coat and skin, burning with pain that seared through every nerve. But the fire in his chest would not be quenched, would not yield, would not bend to fear or injury. Each wound was a reminder of the stakes, each movement a declaration that he would endure anything, fight through anything, to reclaim his son. Finally, with a surge of strength and precision born of rage, grief, and absolute determination, Dominic struck Luca with one final, crushing blow. Watching as the man crumpled to the floor, the fight over, the threat eliminated, and he fell to his knees, bleeding, exhausted, every muscle screaming in agony, yet nothing mattered more than the tiny life in the cage before him. Dominic crawled to Matteo, hands trembling but steady, lifting him from the steel confines and pressing the child close to his chest, whispering through gasps of pain and tears that threatened to fall, "Daddy's here. Daddy's here now." The baby nestled against him instinctively, the warmth of life, trust, and survival flowing between them. And for a moment, the warehouse, the explosions, the gunfire, the betrayal, and the city beyond ceased to exist. There was only Dominic and Matteo, a father and son reunited amidst the carnage. Yet even in that moment of fragile victory, a new sound pierced the temporary calm, the wailing of police sirens approaching, echoing off the steel and concrete, heralding a new threat. A question hanging in the air like smoke: would Dominic survive this war intact? Or would the law, as unforgiving as his enemies, finally bring him down before he could ever see his son grow into the man he had fought so desperately to protect? Bloodied, bruised, and trembling with exhaustion, Dominic pressed Matteo close to his chest, the baby's fragile warmth a beacon in the chaos. And yet the wailing of police sirens grew louder, slicing through the warehouse like knives, a reminder that the battle was far from over. That victory in one sense had already triggered another fight, one against the law, and perhaps, the final adversary he could not predict. He scanned the vast, shadowed space, debris littered the floor, bodies of friend and foe alike strewn across the concrete like the aftermath of some nightmare. And he realized that the delicate balance between life and death was now his sole focus. Each breath he took calculated, each step measured, as he plotted the escape that would keep Matteo alive and out of everyone else's hands. The storm outside had calmed, leaving only the distant rumble of thunder and the rain-slicked streets that reflected the red and blue flashes of approaching police lights. And Dominic knew that the slightest hesitation, the slightest mistake, could turn the brief moment of reunion into tragedy. Yet he refused to yield, refused to let his son see fear, refused to allow any force, human or institutional, to touch the life that now symbolized everything he had ever fought for. Moving like a ghost through the wreckage of the warehouse, Dominic's body ached with pain from the bullets, from the fight with Luca, from every wound inflicted in the last hours. But adrenaline and paternal instinct overrode it, sharpening his movements. Every step precise, every breath controlled, every ounce of energy devoted to navigating the maze of crates, machinery, and shadows that concealed their path to freedom. He could hear the shouts of officers at the warehouse entrance, their voices booming, commanding, and authoritative, and he realized with a surge of calculated urgency that his choices were narrowing: surrender and risk Matteo being taken into protective custody and away from him forever, or escape into the night, bleeding and hunted, carrying a child who was the target of both the underworld and the law. And Dominic's mind raced through options, every contingency considered in mere seconds. He reached a side exit, hearing the click of handcuffs and the bark of police commands behind him. But Dominic's vision narrowed, focus absolute. As he pressed through the door into the dark alley beyond, Matteo still cradled safely against him. And every sound of the city, the distant traffic, the splashing of puddles, the echoing sirens, was filtered through the intensity of his resolve. No one will take him from me, no one will touch my family. Pain flared with every step. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, his gunshot wounds burning with each movement, yet he pushed forward, dragging Matteo toward the shadows of the docks where his men awaited prearranged escape vehicles ready to carry them to temporary safety. The plan executed with precision honed from decades in a world where trust was scarce, loyalty fleeting, and danger constant. Behind him, officers had begun converging on the warehouse perimeter, flashlights sweeping through the darkness, radios crackling with frantic updates, but Dominic moved faster, calculating distances, timing, and angles, weaving through crates and containers like a phantom, every motion a dance with death, every heartbeat echoing his unbreakable promise to Matteo. As he reached the preset rendezvous point, the roar of engines signaled the arrival of his allies. Men loyal beyond measure, vehicles ready, doors flung open to receive them. And Dominic moved quickly, eyes scanning, hands steady, every movement controlled despite the pain that racked his body. He slid into the car, Matteo secured against him, the vehicle peeling away from the docks into the night, weaving through deserted streets, every corner potentially harboring danger, yet every mile taking them further from the immediate threat of Luca's followers. Though the knowledge of pursuit never left him, Dominic glanced down at Matteo, the baby stirring slightly, eyes wide and innocent, and whispered, voice hoarse but resolute, "We're safe. For now, but we'll never stop fighting, never. Not for you." Tears threatened, unbidden. As the weight of everything he had endured pressed against him, Elena's absence, Luca's betrayal, the loss of his men, the risk of capture, but even in the heart of exhaustion and pain, he felt a fierce, unshakable clarity. The city, the enemies, even the law itself could not strip him of what mattered most. The sirens grew fainter as they drove, shadows and light racing past, yet Dominic knew the battle had only escalated. One misstep, one oversight, and the fragile moment of survival could vanish, leaving Matteo exposed to the very forces Dominic had fought so ruthlessly to destroy. And as the car roared through the night, carrying them toward temporary refuge, Dominic made a silent vow that echoed louder than any gunshot, any scream, any threat from friend or foe. I will endure. I will fight. I will protect my son at all costs. And anyone who dares threaten him will answer with blood. The cityscape blurred past, lights flickering like memories of battles past. But Dominic's gaze remained fixed on Matteo, small, fragile, and precious. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself a moment of fierce, unwavering resolve, knowing that this war was far from over, knowing that the approaching dawn would bring new threats. But certain of one truth, Matteo was alive. Dominic was alive, and together, they would survive this storm. No matter the cost, no matter the enemy, no matter the law or the darkness waiting just beyond the edges of the night. Months had passed since the city had burned with gunfire, betrayal, and vengeance, months during which Dominic Caruso had shed the mantle of the feared Mafia boss. The empire that had once defined him dissolved like smoke in the wind, leaving him with nothing but the life he had fought so desperately to preserve. And in the quiet countryside, far from the neon lights, crime, and treachery of New York, he found a peace he hadn't known he could exist in, a peace measured not by power or fear, but by the gentle laughter of Matteo, his son, toddling across fields of green under a sky so vast and open it seemed impossible that such darkness had ever been part of his world. Dominic had traded boardrooms for barns, weapons for plows, and every day, as the sun rose over the rolling hills, he felt the weight of his past life lift slightly, replaced by a profound, almost fragile, sense of belonging, of purpose, as he guided Matteo's tiny hands across soil, teaching him how to plant seeds that would grow into life. And in those moments, every scar, every wound, every night of fear that had plagued him seemed to fade, eclipsed by the simple, radiant joy of a child's smile. The farmhouse they now called home was modest, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon, and though there were no guards, no hidden weapons, no loyal men lying in wait, Dominic's instincts remained sharp, always alert to the slightest sound. The faintest movement, a shadow that might signal danger. For the world he had left behind had taught him that peace was never guaranteed, and yet in this sanctuary, he allowed himself moments of laughter, of quiet, of tender care that had once seemed impossible for a man who had spent decades commanding fear. Each Sunday, Dominic walked the winding path to a small cemetery where Elena Romano rested. The woman whose love had transformed him, whose absence still haunted the corners of his mind, yet whose memory now brought him solace instead of pain. He knelt before her grave, placing delicate white roses in the soil, their petals pristine against the weathered stone, and whispered softly, almost as if speaking into the wind, "I kept my promise, Elena. He's safe." The words felt both heavy and liberating, a release of decades of grief, guilt, and regret, and as he straightened, he felt Matteo's small hand slip into his, tugging him forward, urging him back toward the life they were building together, toward fields where laughter could grow alongside the crops, where innocence and love could thrive untouched by the shadows of his past. Matteo ran ahead, barefoot on the grass, spinning in circles as his laughter echoed across the open land. The pure, untainted joy a balm to Dominic's soul. Each giggle a note of music that slowly stitched together the frayed edges of his heart. A reminder that life could be beautiful, even for a man who had been the architect of fear and violence. A man who had survived betrayal, loss, and bloodshed, yet now existed only to nurture, to protect, and to love his child without reservation. Dominic watched him, a smile touching the corners of his lips for the first time in years. And as he followed, hand in hand, the soft crunch of soil underfoot grounding him in the present, he allowed himself to imagine a future untouched by vengeance, a life where Matteo could grow safely, away from the enemies who had once threatened everything he held dear. A life where laughter, not fear, would define their days. But as they walked toward the farmhouse, a subtle tension brushed at the edges of his newfound serenity, a shadow flickering across the long lane that led to their home. Dominic's instincts, honed through decades of warfare, sharpened instantly, and from the corner of his eye, he spotted a black car parked at a distance, tinted windows reflecting the sunlight like cold, watchful eyes, and though nothing moved inside the vehicle, he felt the familiar, icy prickle of being observed. He froze, tightening his grip on Matteo's hand without alarm, careful not to disturb the child's innocence, and watched silently as a man inside the car lifted a phone to his lips, speaking in a low, urgent whisper, "Sir? The boy's alive." Dominic's chest tightened, a mix of relief and tension coiling inside him like a serpent. And even in this fragile moment of peace, he understood the truth he had always known: his past life, his enemies, the power he once wielded, could never be fully left behind. Danger might lurk in the distance, quiet, patient, but it would never vanish entirely. Yet as he led Matteo back across the fields, sunlight warming his shoulders, wind tousling his hair, and the gentle rhythm of the child's laughter echoing across the landscape, Dominic allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that redemption, love, and a future untouched by blood were possible. That even a man like him, forged in violence, could find a place in the world where he could simply be a father. A man who had lost everything but gained the most important thing of all. And as they disappeared into the farmhouse, leaving the watchful black car behind at a distance, the camera of fate lingered on that vehicle, on the whisper into the phone, and the faint, ominous words hung in the air, a reminder that while Dominic had found peace, the story was far from over, the game of shadows, love, and vengeance continuing silently, patiently, waiting for the moment when the king might be called to rise again. Dominic didn't move a muscle, his senses razor-sharp despite the months of peaceful routine, the laughter of Matteo still echoing in his ears like a fragile shield against the shadow that had appeared at the edge of their perfect world. The black car remained still, seemingly patient, as if it had been waiting, watching, and Dominic felt the old rush of adrenaline. The instincts that had once commanded empires and orchestrated wars now churning within him, not for power, but for the life of the child he held so close, a life that represented his second chance. A legacy untouched by bloodshed if only he could protect it. He slowed his pace with Matteo at his side, one hand lightly resting on the boy's shoulder, and allowed his eyes to study the vehicle without showing fear. The mind of a predator scanning for weaknesses, angles, and opportunities, tracing every reflection on the tinted glass, every shadow inside, every detail that might reveal the intent of the stranger. For Dominic knew that the world rarely allowed peace to flourish unchallenged. And a threat this subtle, this calculated, was not coincidental. The wind carried the faint scent of gasoline, dust, and something metallic, indicators of movement, of presence, of watchfulness, and Dominic's mind catalogued everything, his heart steady but focused, every muscle coiled, every thought prepared, for the moment when action would be necessary, when he would have to rise again, not as a man hiding from the past, but as the father who had survived everything to this point, the man who would face any danger to keep Matteo alive. Matteo, oblivious for now, laughed again, chasing a butterfly that danced in the sun's warm rays, and Dominic allowed himself a small, bittersweet smile, savoring the innocence, the light, the simplicity, all the while aware that this moment of calm was precarious, that the black car, the shadowed figure, and the whispered message on a phone outside were harbingers of forces still at work. Forces that had not forgotten him, forces that would challenge his claim to peace, his claim to life outside the empire he had once ruled. Dominic's mind replayed every lesson he had learned in Blood and Fire, every betrayal, every attack, every loss, and he knew instinctively that the man inside the car was likely reporting, waiting for orders, evaluating him as he evaluated the threat itself. The whispered words, "Sir? The boy's alive," hung in the air like a warning, a reminder that Matteo's existence was valuable, coveted, and that peace, no matter how carefully cultivated, was always a temporary illusion in a world where power, vengeance, and greed moved silently and invisibly. Dominic decided that visibility would be a weapon. He slowed further, crouching slightly as Matteo's hand slipped into his own, his voice calm, soothing, masking the tension that coiled like a serpent in his chest. "Stay close, Matteo. Everything's all right. Daddy's right here." The boy nodded, trusting implicitly, unaware of the danger. And Dominic's gaze never left the car, analyzing every detail, from the angle of the steering wheel to the slightest reflection of the sun off glass or metal, piecing together the intentions, the timing, the possible moves that could follow. And then, just as the boy reached for a patch of sunlight to touch, the man inside the car moved. The faintest shift of a head, the slight turn of a wrist, signaling life, awareness, the fact that they had been seen but had not yet acted. Dominic's pulse quickened, muscles coiling, instinct screaming readiness, the calm of the countryside replaced instantly with the tension of the predator preparing to strike, knowing that any hesitation could cost everything he had fought for. Every month of peace, every smile, every laugh, every moment of innocence he had fought to preserve. Dominic took a slow, deliberate breath, lowering Matteo's hand to grasp his own, and whispered in a voice that was both reassuring and steel-hard, "We keep walking? Don't look back. We keep walking, and we move as one." Every step toward the farmhouse became a calculated act, every movement masking the storm of strategy and anticipation within him. And as they neared the edge of the field, the black car started to move, silently gliding over the grass and dirt, tires muffled by months of planning. And Dominic felt the unmistakable charge of tension surge. They were testing him, gauging his reaction, probing his defenses, waiting for him to make a mistake, to show vulnerability. But Dominic, father and survivor, would not falter. He picked up the pace slightly, Matteo still safe, the child's laughter now a fragile counterpoint to the sound of the approaching vehicle. And Dominic's mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, and defensive maneuvers. Every option calculated, every possible outcome considered. The lessons of his violent past merging seamlessly with the tenderness of his present, creating a strategy born not of empire, but of pure, unyielding love. And then the figure inside the car raised a hand, a silent signal, the air thick with anticipation. And Dominic's heart tightened, knowing that the next few moments would define whether the peace he had built, the life he had nurtured, would endure, or whether the darkness of his past would descend once more, demanding blood, demanding power, demanding a reckoning that could destroy the fragile sanctuary he and Matteo had claimed. As the car slowed, engine humming softly, a whisper of movement inside, the camera of fate seemed to pause, the world holding its breath alongside Dominic, the child unaware, and the shadow outside looming ever closer. The final test of the father's resolve hanging in the balance. And Dominic's voice, low, calm, but unyielding, whispered into the wind, "You want him? Come and take him. But know this, you will never leave alive." The black car stopped just at the edge of the field, dark windows glinting ominously, and the screen of fate fades to black, leaving one question burning in the night: would Dominic protect his son and survive this final threat? Or would the shadows of his past finally reach into the light of their new life?